we haven't mentioned it but a few episodes, and in those few episodes we've been saying that we are getting down to the grand finale of Revitalize and Replant.
Down to the end. They're going to haul both of us off to the senior living center and put us away in assisted living. Is that no? Maybe not. Maybe not yet.
Well, maybe a little while. I would tell you what my boys are going to do to me if I start acting ornery or in a way that is embarrassing. But I don't think assisted suicide is probably a good topic for.
Probably not. Probably not. Well, go ahead. You started it. So we've got 290 some episodes behind us, and we got a handful in front of us. So we'll get close to 300 probably, won't we? Something like that, I believe.
I think it'll be 296-ish in that
296.
range.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. And then
well, tell us about your new podcast, Mark.
Well, yeah, it's Revitalize and Replant, but I'm taking it and we're gonna spin it off of this one, and I'll have Mark Halleck with me. Mark is the pastor of Calvary Church in Inglewood. Church had about 30 people in it 15 years ago when he arrived. They're about 800 a weekend now, but more importantly, they have a network of 30 replanted churches they've helped all across the Mountain States. And Mark has a residency there where he raises up replanters. Great guy. And then a friend of mine named Dan Hurst, who is an official voice talent. He does voiceover work for movies and national television commercials. He and I we've pastored together. We planted churches together. We're dear friends, went to college together. So the three of us are just going to have a great time at Revitalize and Replant, that podcast. Now, you got to subscribe to it. If you say this one, you subscribe to ours we're on right now, you're going to go with Tom. You got to pick which parent you want to go with. No, you can go to both.
That is not true.
You can have joint custody.
As we go our separate ways, you can go with both of us, and you don't have to choose which weekend. I mean, you can come.
No, you don't. You don't. So you can go to right now. You can go on your little device, and you can go to revitalizeandreplant.com. And what will come up will be our pilot episode. We did a pilot episode, and you can listen to us. And then the 1st of April, we'll have 2 episodes a week of Revitalize and Replant. But subscribe when you go to Revitalize and Replant. Subscribe so you'll be one of our founding charter subscribers. And sure enough, and then you do that. And then, Tom, tell them about your new podcast. So we're really just dividing and having 2 great podcasts instead of one. So what's happening?
What's happening is I'm Happy Days and Mark is Laverne and Shirley. He's the spinoff of Happy Days. By the way, did you see that Cindy Williams died?
I did. And you know what? I also saw Danny Most being interviewed about her. Do you remember Danny Most?
Oh yeah, I certainly do.
He was he Potsy? No, he wasn't Potsy. Potsy was the blackheaded.
No. Henry Winkler was the fine.
Well, Henry Winkler. Danny Most was a redheaded guy on there, and he would sing. He would sing sometimes on the show. Once in a while, he would sing. So I have this fine collection of Danny Most albums here in my basement. And the next time you come over, we'll just sit and we'll just rock out to Danny Most, who was on Laverne and Shirley and on Happy Days. Nobody's listening anymore. We've completely lost all of our listeners right now.
All right. While they're not listening, let me just tell you, Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley were 2 of my favorite theme songs. Laverne and Shirley, number 1, Happy Days, number 2. Okay. Love that. Love those theme songs. So those are just memories from the 60s and the 70s for which people have absolutely no concern whatsoever about that. well, Mark, as we get down to our grand finale, we're going to be talking about a series of topics related to hope. In the world that we're living in, you're hearing so many things about bad news of the church and why the church is not going to make it, and why the small church is a weak church. And we could go on and on like that. There is a time, and this is an Ecclesiastes time, where we have to say there is a time for hope, because in the midst of this, there is a lot of hope. And we're going to address it, why we have hope for revitalizing churches. This could be replants, revitalizing. And yes, Mark, you asked the question. Our podcast, if you're with me right now, if you're subscribed here, you'll stay with me. And it's called the Church Answers Podcast. And basically, it's going to be rapid fire 3 podcasts in a row, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. And we're going to cover brief issues. We're going to give church answers to church questions, and we're going to sometimes be funny. I'm going to attempt humor. It may be weak, and we're going to we may cover some esoteric issues in addition to others, but you'll be able to get 3 just bang, bang, bang every week like that, 10 minutes each, very short. So go to revitalizingreplant.com and subscribe there at Mark's podcast in the future. Stay here for Church Answers, the Church Answers podcast. Now, back to this information. Why we have hope for revitalizing churches. Mark, I was talking to Sam, my oldest son, and I said, well, what do you think is going to be like doing this future podcast without Mark Clifton? And he said, well, I got to be honest with you, Dad. It's going to miss something major. And he meant this positively. He said, what Mark does is in the midst of providing practical advice, always provides hope. And when you leave, I cannot let hope depart. I got to remember that hope is there. But I thought that's pretty cool. You're not only known as Mr. International Harvester, Mr. Replant, Mr. Revitalize. All of those labels apply well, but you're also known as the church hope person. That's a pretty good thing to have, Mark.
Well, I appreciate that. And, for the guys who are watching and listening, I have to battle for that. It doesn't come natural for me. There are some people that are just wired up optimistically and they're just always on a high. I'm not that way. I tend to always be waiting for the shoe to fall. I tend to wrestle with those kinds of things, but I battle it. That's how you do it. Paul said, I fought the good fight. So I battle it, and you can battle it, and you can have victory over it. And even in this topic about that, we've been in revitalizing and talking about dying churches. The reality is God has always done his most amazing work at some of the darkest times. I mean, that'll preach all day long, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right at the shore of the Red Sea, in the lion's den that night. Right at the furnace before they got thrown in. Paul, I love what my friend Frank Lewis said. Oh, he's such a good preacher. I was with him this week in Oklahoma, and Frank said in that sweet way that only Frank can. He said, "With swollen lips, bruised face, and swollen eyes, Paul sang at midnight."
Wow.
You just don't think about it that way, but he did. And there's hope at midnight. And man, guys, we are working and serving in a place where if it gets dark, we know something good's about to happen. I'm serious about that. That's been through all the scripture, through all of church history. And in some ways you say, man, it's so bad right now. Yeah. And this is all about how God's going to show us how great he really is. I mean, where are you going to find bread that these may eat? I mean, this is an impossible situation, but now the disciples are about to experience one of the biggest miracles they've ever seen. So that's where my hope comes from.
And that echoes our first point. Bad news is good news. The bad news is the darkness. The bad news is the church decline and the church closures. The good news is we're on the precipice of something, and we're awakening to the reality that we got to do something about it. We've got to yield to God in this.
Yes. We slumbered through the first part of the 21st century. We really did. We slumbered through it. We were sort of riding some of the wave of the 80s and the 90s of some mega churches and some new things. And we really, and I love the fact that we've all seemed to have become awakened to the idea that, wait a minute, the church is in some trouble right now. And You're not going to deal with it until you know it. I know you have these numbers better than I do, but I read recently and this may or not be correct, but this is what I read, and this is what I've shared a few times, that the median size evangelical church in the late 1990s, early 2000 was about 130. And today the median size evangelical church is under 70. So in about 23 years, it has dropped in half. I mean, that is stunning. I mean, you carry that out another 20 years, we'll be gone. Now, that's not going to happen, but you cannot ignore that when our population continues to grow. And when technology has given us all kinds of ways to do ministry, we didn't have ways to do it 25 years ago. And yet your average church in North America, median size has dropped from 130 to 67 in 23 years.
Here's another perspective on it. If you're in a church that has 250 in attendance,
okay,
your church is in the top 8% in the United States. I mean, we know 10, 20 years ago, we would say, now, is that a small church or a mid-sized church? That's a very large church. Top 8% today. 92% are below 250. Amazing that's taking place.
And we talk, I talk a lot about the importance of the smaller church and the normative sized church. But the reality of it is, Tom, we're getting smaller, and that is not good.
Right.
Unless the getting smaller is a way of preparing us for a greater work. In other words, it could be, in God and his providence, has realized a lot of our growth was not real. It wouldn't sustain. If you want to use the analogy of the sowed and the seer, sow the seed and the sower, it got roots and grew quickly, but now it's gone, right? We could have had some of that. And so now as we head into a time of perhaps real revival, but also real revival always comes and renewal always comes with resistance and with suffering. And I mean, the church Jesus came and suffered, and the first century church was built on the suffering of the saints. And so it's altogether possible that's what we're going to enter. So maybe God is do you want to use the word pruning his church to make it stronger and more fruitful? Maybe that's what's happened.
And in the midst of this, denominations and networks are more aware of the need than ever. As a matter of fact, the phrase revitalization is still a new phrase. The phrase replant is a new phrase. So when you start talking about these venues that we have to strengthen our churches, just this podcast, which is ours, which is about to be yours, revitalize and replant, those two words are relatively new to the nomenclature of church health these days. So now we have that awareness too.
I would suggest to you that if we would have had podcast in 1988, if that was a possibility, and we had a podcast called Revitalize and Replant, it wouldn't have been very popular. I mean, nobody would have, like, what in the world, we'd have to have some, how to break the 1,000 barrier, or, how to start your mega church, on a shoestring, or, how to reach Saddleback Sam and Saddleback Sally. That's what everybody would have been listening to. Nobody would have tuned into, in 1988, Revitalize Your Dying Church. I mean, I agree. Our attention has been appropriately placed now to the issue before us.
Gosh, you're bringing back memories. 1988 was when I did my first consultation. So that's how far back that goes. I was a pastor in St. Petersburg, Florida. I'm recording this from Bradenton, Florida right now. So it's just across the Skyway Bridge from me, the church where I was. And I thought I had memories by being this close in physical proximity, but now you're bringing it back. By Saddleback Sam. Wow. That's been a while. That has been a while. I think I've asked you this question before. Before Purpose Driven, what did Rick Warren call it?
I don't know. You stumped me. What was it?
Cameo.
Cameo. I did not know that. Did it stand for something?
Contemporary Approaches to Ministry, Evangelism, and Organization.
Wow.
I went to a Cameo conference led by Rick Warren in Alabama at whatever the Baptist camp is. I can't remember the name of it. But I went there and somebody said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to a Cameo conference. There's this new guy called Rick Warren." Hey, I probably told you a story, but I got to tell you anyway. He gave an example of the types of topical sermons that he thought could reach the unchurched. And he said, "Now here's one example. How to affair-proof your marriage." And so he showed that with an outline. The next Sunday, so one of my deacons comes up to me and said, "Do we have a problem with Alabama pastors?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, 7 of them advertised in the Birmingham News yesterday how to affair-proof your marriage for your sermon." That was pre-internet, and they got caught anyway.
Yes, pre-internet. Listen, nobody knows how much plagiarism went on prior to the internet. Trust me on that. Trust me. I'm
Oh,
serious. Oh my word. When I was a kid and a young man, we'd go to these state evangelism conferences, and every pastor around me and my dad, every pastor would be writing every note from whatever that evangelist, and they weren't writing those for their own personal edification. We knew they were getting like 3 weeks worth of sermons there. They were, Tom. And there's
I
nothing wrong
know.
with that.
I know nothing. I know my
There's
name
nothing
is
wrong with
Sergeant
that.
Schultz. I know nothing. I'm
Don't
not
you
going
think?
to.
Don't you think that some of the men who heard Paul preach would jot down some notes and then basically say some of the very same things when they preached? I mean, he would want them to do that. Now, that's different than taking word for word in the same illustrations. We're not talking
Yes.
about plagiarism here, but yeah. Anyway, I
Well, that
sorry,
was a
got off
very
topic.
popular sermon title for a week or two there. How to
That's true.
your
I don't have
how
fair
to a
proof.
fair proof your marriage. All the churches in the many churches in Alabama advertising in the Birmingham News. Whatever. And the retreat was Shaco Springs. It just came to my
Oh
mind.
yes, I've been to Shaco Springs. Yes.
Near Talladega. He did this conference there. I was pastoring in Birmingham. Fortunately, I did not preach on how to fair-proof your marriage that week.
Okay.
Probably, if I had not had my sermon prepared,
You probably would have.
I probably would have. Okay, hope for revitalizing
You want to
churches.
hear a real story? Do you want to hear a real story?
Is
You're
there an
going to.
implication that mine is not real?
No, it is real. But my first semester of preaching class at Midwestern back a long time ago in the early 80s, I preached this sermon about Peter getting out of the boat, and that there was a reason to get out of the boat. You heard the word of God. There was a reward for getting out of the requisite was you get a word from the God, and the reason it was a requisite, reason, reward, and that's it. Those are the 3 points: the requisite, the reason, and the reward. I was real proud of that, right? So I preached it. And my preaching professor, when I was done, he said, "I just have one question, Mr. Clifton." He said, "What state evangelism conference did you lift that from?" And the truth was, he was right. I'd heard Jack Taylor preach those 3
Oh,
points
Jack Taylor.
when I was like 15 years old.
Oh, gosh. Too old.
And I still remember those points. Okay.
I remember Jack Taylor
Yes.
preaching that sermon. His was called "Get Out of the Boat and Get in the Water."
That's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
I think it
that.
was. I think it was. It was.
Probably
It
came
was.
close to saying a few things as well. Okay. Point number 3. If you have awareness, you will then seek and get solutions. Look, Mark,
Yes.
one of the great travesties in this bad news is that evangelism is waning. Guess what is being talked about more than anything in many churches and many denominations today? Evangelism is coming back.
And it's being talked about appropriately, not in a highly structured, we're going to sell you, this Amway or Shackley, or here's the presentation, but rather, how do you do it organically? How do you really talk about Jesus in a very organic, very natural, very personal kind of way? How do you engage in gospel conversations, which I really think is making a difference, so that evangelism becomes just part and parcel of who we are, not a task that we do on a particular night of the week, and something that we've been perhaps guilted into doing or whatever. And it's not a program. That's what I'm trying to say. I think we're realizing evangelism is not a program; it's a lifestyle, and that's beginning to permeate all. And that's an actual result of discipleship. And as we focus more on discipleship rather than church membership, disciples are people who are in love with Jesus, and you talk about what you're in love with. So there.
Very, very well stated. And North American Mission Board has done a very incredible job by offering 3 circles as a tool that you can use in your lifestyle approach. Absolutely. Not a program, but a tool, a great, simple tool to use. Awareness helps with the loneliness factor. Here's been one of the great things that's emerged out of this awareness. Pastors know that they're not alone. They are not this singular failure. It is a struggle that most pastors are going through, most church leaders are going through. And now there's community and company and shared solutions and hope in the midst of this community now.
Right. And, the adversary uses social media for a lot of bad things, and adversary gets a lot of mileage out of social media. whether it's pornography or just putting people in polarized camps or having even Christian people talk bad about each other. But on the other end of that, what Satan means for evil, God can use for good. And the internet and social media has connected isolated leaders who have felt alone and like I'm the only one doing this with other people like them. And I'll never forget, Charles Cheney told me one time, he said, Mark,
Charles Cheney, there's
Charles
another
Cheney.
name.
He said, Mark, I was just a young man. He said, this is before the internet, before we had computers in our offices. So, but he said, Mark, relationships empower people. God always uses relationships to empower you. And the more relationships, the more viable, meaningful Christian relationships you can be a part of, they will be a source of strength and power to you. And the fewer relationships you have, you'll be weaker. I've never forgotten that. And the internet has allowed us to have relationships across wide spaces and time zones with people just like us who are going through some of the same things. And that's been a real positive thing. I think one of the reasons guys don't feel nearly as isolated as they did is obviously they can be connected 24 hours a day. I mean, they can, there's all kinds of Facebook clubs, all kinds of groups, internet groups, and I'm on many of them. And sometimes it'll be 2:00 in the morning because I can't sleep much anymore. And I'll look at it and some pastor somewhere will say, man, I need your prayer. This just happened to me today. I had some families leave. And immediately, Tom, there's a bunch of guys that get on there and say, man, I'm praying for it right now. Here's what happened to me. That couldn't have happened 30 years ago. That guy would have really felt out there and been alone.
And let me mention this. I hope it's not a shameless plug, but at Church Answers, we have a couple of thousand people in our active community.
Yes.
And when you post at Church Answers Central, immediately people are coming to respond. It's somewhat like Facebook, but it has a lot of subject matter expertise, but it also has a huge community that's there.
Yeah, I would agree. That's good stuff.
So, Mark, we started talking about evangelism, and that was, we're beginning to see that as one of the issues that arise. That's going to be our part 2 as we have hope for revitalizing churches. We're going to laser focus on this topic of evangelism. So, stay tuned. Get ready for the Mark and Thom show, which now we call Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. And get ready for the sequels and the spinoffs, and they're going to happen. But come back for this next episode. We're going to talk seriously, but hopefully, about evangelism. We'll see you in the next episode.